Hello and welcome to REALink, which promotes real conversations about pertinent concerns. REALink is a virtual conversation series where we will be engaging our special guest and you, of course, to explore various topics that matter in our society. The theme for this year, 2021, Rebuilding the Community, where we seek to reconnect with communities that have been adversely affected by societal issues and explore what has and can be done to break the cycle of hurt. REALink is also a campaign to raise funds to promote the work that is being done by the Lutheran Community Services, otherwise simply known as LCCS. As a non-profit organization, as a social service agency, LCCS has been actively engaging and empowering individuals and families to rebuild and sustain relationships. Now, focusing on restorative practices, LCCS has served and continues to serve families, schools, institutes, residential homes, and various organizations to restore relationships that have been harmed, connecting communities together. Now, LCCS is a full member of the National Council of Social Service and has been accorded Institution of a Public Character status. I'm Augustine Aswan, and it's both my pleasure and privilege to be your host and moderator for the REALink Conversation Series and online fundraising campaign alongside the speakers who will be sharing today. And with us today, of course, Paul Shoemaker, who is coming to us live all the way from Austin, Texas, United States of America. Thank you for being here, Paul, and welcome to one of the REALink Virtual Conversation Series. Thank you. So just a quick word here. Today is the third session in our series, and it's titled CSR, Making It Work for Companies Big and Small. And every fortnight, just like today on a Friday, we feature local and international speakers. And today, of course, we have Paul Shoemaker, who will be sharing their perspectives on different topics. And this series kicked off in June, and we'll be running this all the way till November. And here at LCCS, our aim is to create a safe and meaningful space for our speakers to talk frankly about what matters, which is why we'd like you to stay connected with LCCS, with one another, and most certainly, we also want to invite you today to be part of the panel discussion, to take a moment to write your comments and questions in the chat box, and we'll like to seek your kind-hearted donation as well. Please use the QR code at the bottom of the screen. We'll be eligible for a one-to-one matching as REALink is part of the Tote Board Enhanced Fundraising Program. And all donations above $10 are also eligible for a 250% tax deduction. And having covered that, without further ado, let's kick off our next session in our REALink series. I'd like to hand over now to Paul Shoemaker, who's going to tell us more about himself and some very interesting insights as well. Paul, take it away, please.
Thank you so much, Augustine. It is wonderful to be back in Singapore. This is actually my third visit to Singapore in the last 5 years. The first two, of course, were in person. And I very much look forward to being back in person again the next time I'm talking to folks in Singapore. This is such an important topic. Slide up. So I'm going to talk today about corporate social responsibility. And to me, I believe this is a topic that's more important than it ever has been in the world today, whether it's in Singapore or the United States or anywhere in the world. And I want to start just briefly from a story of where I grew up. Next slide. So I grew up in Iowa in the Midwest part of the United States, and certainly many of you recognize this as a cornfield, rows and corns going back and forth. And for me, as a young man growing up in the hot summers in August in Iowa, I would detassel corn. Slide down. So for those of you that don't know what detasseling corn means, it means walking up and down those stalks of corn that are about as high as your head when it gets to August and you're pulling out certain tassels on some of the corn so that that hybrid corn will fertilize and it'll become corn feed and corn that we can eat later on in the year. So the reason why that story is relevant is because in my alma mater was Iowa State University, which was the main agriculture university in Iowa. And in 1957 at my alma mater, 3 graduate students, they were studying how farmers purchased hybrid corn, that same kind of corn that I would detassel in the summers. In 1957, they studied it. They sort of did some research on it. And in 1962, they wrote a paper called Diffusion of Innovations, which that led to a tool called the adoption curve, which I'm sure some of you have seen before in other contexts and other situations. But I want to use the adoption curve to sort of guide our conversation today about corporate social responsibility. So slide up. In case it's not obvious, the way I'll do my talk today is I'll use a couple slides at a time, describe them to you briefly, and then I'll come back to as much on-person, on-screen time as I possibly can. So the adoption curve talks about how different products and technologies and services tend to be adopted. And it starts on the left side with innovators. Then there are folks known as early adopters, sort of those folks that'll follow the innovators. That next stage, going from the early adopters to the early majority, sometimes that's referred to as crossing the chasm. And in the adoption of any sort of technology or process or movement or way of doing business, getting from the early adopters to early majority, that's a really important time. Because if you get past that, then the late majority and the laggards tend to follow on behind of that. So each of us has been a part of this for different products and services we may use in life. Next slide. And I want to use this just as an example. So it's a little bit of a busy slide. So let me just explain it to you for a minute. So across the bottom, of course, are different periods of time. And going up the left, the y-axis, bottom to top, that is percentage of United States households that have adopted particular technologies. So if you start on the left there, see things like telephone, electricity, radio, et cetera. And I think this is true in many parts of the world, Singapore and other places. I'm just using the US as an example. And then as you start to get over the right side, you start seeing things like, VCRs and cell phones and computers and the internet. And the two sort of big yellow lines that I use are just sort of a way of demonstrating that up until about, the 70s, that rate of adoption was, it was at a certain pace that kind of went along. It was much slower than that yellow arrow on the right, which shows the rate of adoption of technologies in the last 20 years and how much has accelerated and how much compression there is in the amount of time to adopt these different sort of technologies. I also think that adoption curve does a great job of explaining corporate social responsibility and the evolution of corporate social responsibility. Slide down. So I'm going to talk just in a minute about how that adoption curve explains to us how corporate social responsibility, or CSR, has evolved and adopted. And I'm also going to posit some ways in which I think it'll evolve in the future and how companies can be effective in their CSR. Just a brief moment or two about me so you know who I am and where I'm coming from. My first job out of business school in college was at Nestle. And some of you might remember that Nestle's record on social responsibility back in the 60s, 70s, 80s was not particularly good. So I joined that company sort of shortly after they had their problems with infant formula in Africa. The next company I went on to was Microsoft in the 1990s. In the 1990s, Microsoft was not known much for its social responsibility. It was all about technology. It was all about work. So it's interesting that I started at those two companies that sort of initially had negative associations or negative brand connections with CSR. The next 17 years, from 1998 through 2015, I worked largely in the nonprofit and the public sector in the States. And I was involved mainly with an organization called Social Venture Partners. And the last 6 years now, I have been a private consultant. And it's so interesting to me how those two companies, Nestle and Microsoft, that in the 80s and 90s didn't have particularly good reputations, today they are leaders in corporate social responsibility. They're leaders in CSR. Nestle in terms of water and conservation and use of water around the world, and Microsoft in a wide range of ways, especially around cybersecurity these days, how artificial intelligence is used, et cetera. So CSR can be something that can really evolve in a company. And the trait that I think has become really important in a lot of companies, in particular in those two, is what I call cross-sector fluency. That's a trait of leaders that I talk about in my book that I just published 3 months ago. And Augustine, I think we'll talk about that in a minute. The last comment I'll make about that is being in the private sector, then spending time in the public and nonprofit sectors. And in the year 2021, it tells me how incredibly important the private sector is in social change and social challenges. So CSR, I think we're going to talk about the evolution of it. Just understand, I think the power of the private sector and the importance of CSR has never been greater than it is today. So slide back up. So as I said just a minute ago, I wanted to use the adoption curve, which is down there at the bottom of the screen now, and I've kind of scrunched it down to sort of explain the evolution of CSR over time. So and I'm going to use some examples from America. And just to be clear, some of my comments will be a little bit American-centric. I'm trying to make sure these lessons are as global as they possibly can be. But so some of my experiences and my examples are about America, but I think they apply in Asia, they apply in Europe, and they apply in many other parts of the world. So I took the adoption curve here and I sort of crunched it down, the one we looked at a minute ago. And I just want to briefly sort of summarize how I think this has evolved over the course of time to get to where we are today. And I won't go into this in great detail, but just know that when I think of the evolution of CSR, and I'm sure these slides will be shared so anybody can use them, I've looked at it in terms of sort of companies that were key at that moment in time, the context going on around them, the sort of structure of CSR, what's the new edge of, sort of the leadership edge of CSR at that time, and what are some of the key actors in the sector at that time as well. So 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were companies like Patagonia. The context in America and other parts of the world was civil rights and unrest, and that context always has a lot of effect on CSR. The structure tended to be still pretty siloed, and it was sort of more about the idea of a social contract. And the emergent idea was that companies didn't just exist to generate profits. And the actors sort of in CSR at that time were sort of more activist types. If we move to the 90s now we start to have companies like Newman's Own, which is a company in America. All the profits go to social purpose organizations, social purpose causes. That was the only reason that company was created. It was the first of its kind and pretty innovative. The context in the 90s was, of course, growing globalization. Structurally, there were some companies that were authentic. There was also a lot of companies that were still doing what we would call greenwashing. They kind of talked it, but they really weren't practicing it very well. I think the edge at that time was companies starting to get more engaged and more connected to their communities, not just sort of in the private sector, but starting to emerge into their communities. And one of the leading actors was a group called Business for Social Responsibility. Next slide. In the 2000s, you start to see big companies like Unilever kick in. The context around the world was sort of a lot more dangerous, but terrorism, disasters, again, this context always affects the direction of CSR. The structure now, I don't think there were people sort of faking it, but it was still kind of a strategy that was bolted on, if you will, to the normal strategies of a company. The leading edge at that time was sustainability, and you started to see companies now that were called B Corps or B corporations emerge. Next slide. And in this most recent decade now you started to see some of the biggest companies in the world emerge into CSR. Walmart, there's a lot of things people don't like about them. When it comes to energy conservation, they are one of the leading companies in the world now today. The context, of course, is the degree to which technology is sort of taking over everything. Structurally, I think now we're in a period of time in the last several years where companies are a lot more aligned in their social mission and their purpose and their business mission. The sort of leading edge now of CSR is around climate. And one of the most important actors in it is the United Nations and their SDGs, their social development goals that they created for companies to follow and sort of guide their work. Next slide. So I'm going to just state these and show these briefly, and then I'll take it down and I'll talk about these with you face to face. That sort of whole evolution of CSR to get to where it is today. I think there's a number of factors that enabled organizations to be effective in CSR. It's about leadership, top down and bottom up. It's about thinking expansively, not just protectively. There becomes more and more alignment over time between the for-profit and the social missions and competencies. Companies over time get more in sync with their customers, employees. Data and measurement really matter. This can't just be a concept and a good idea. There's got to be data and measurement. When it gets built into and integrated with the brand, and also when it becomes, CSR becomes something very authentic and has a real sense of longevity. Slide down. So that was a series of slides just to sort of give a sense of the evolution of CSR. I'm going to go back and just sort of give you an example of each one of those to sort of amplify it. But those to me are 7 key success factors in the evolution of CSR in America, in Asia, and really everywhere across the world. So the first one I listed was leadership. It certainly needs to be bottoms up, but I also think in corporations it needs to be top down. One of the most positive, powerful examples of that is Paul Pullman at Unilever. Over the last 10 to 20 years, Unilever as a company, they're very profitable, they're very global, they're billions in revenues. They've also become one of the most socially responsible companies on the face of the earth. And their leadership, it couldn't just be top down. It had to be, or bottoms up. It also had to be top down. It had to start from the top. The second factor I talk about was to think expansively, not just protectively. Sometimes when companies sort of start first thinking about CSR, it's about protecting their assets and protecting their reputation versus thinking expansively about what's possible because of CSR. I think a great example, that's Nike. In the 90s, they were criticized pretty correctly for a lot of the labor practices that they weren't paying attention to in other parts of the world. They woke up to that, and initially they were trying to sort of protect their brand, but over time they said, hey, let's don't just sort of try to avoid the negative things. Let's think expansively and build it into the Nike brand. So they're a good example of a company that was not thinking about CSR. They thought protectively, and then they thought expansively. The third factor I mentioned was the alignment between the for-profit and the social missions, as well as the competencies. I talked about Walmart just a minute ago. They're obviously, along with Amazon, they're one of the biggest companies in the world. They have a deep, obviously, driving for-profit mission, but they also have a social mission now around energy and conservation. And they consume as much energy as any company on the face of the earth. And they have an incentive to reduce their energy consumption, not just to reduce their profits, but to improve the environment. So to me, they're a great example of a company that's found alignment between their for-profit and their social missions. The fourth one I mentioned was companies over time getting in sync with their customers and with their employees. Good example of that, company by the name of Warby Parker. I believe they're a global company. They make eyeglasses. And when they sort of started the eyeglass business, they did it as a way to sort of simplify the process for consumers. What they also realized was, eyesight is an issue around the world. So for every pair of glasses that they sell to make profits and revenues in their companies, they will donate a pair of glasses to somewhere else in the world. That to me is a wonderful example of sort of being in sync with your customers and your employees and with people all across the world. The fifth one was data and measurement. Salesforce is sort of the leading CRM, customer relationship management software in the world, or one of them. They have a strategy that they've practiced from the very start, which is 1% of their profits, 1% of their revenues, and 1% of their employees' volunteer time all go to social purpose and social causes. And they have published an annual report card on CSR for many years now. They were one of the first ones to do so. Now more and more companies do that. But being able to sort of have data and measurement to back up the idea of CSR is really critical. It can't just be a concept. The sixth idea I proposed was the notion of when companies start to build it into and integrate it into their brand. Mars as a company, as a maker of foods all over the world, they also have begun to, they've developed partnerships over the years with companies with nonprofit organizations like CARE. CARE is trying to alleviate poverty in places like Africa. Mars is trying to source products like cocoa in Africa. They have figured out a partnership to where there's an integration between what they need and how they get their products and their supply chain out of Africa, but it also builds their brand in partnering with someone like Care USA. And lastly, authenticity and longevity. Authenticity and longevity of their commitment to CSR. Levi Strauss, the jeans company, they were one of the leading companies in the 90s, and they are still on the leading edge. So 30 years later, they have stuck with us. So they've now proven their commitment to CSR, their authenticity, and they have demonstrated a real longevity and commitment to it. So those are some of the key factors that I think that lead to what make a company effective in CSR. Slide up. So let's talk about where we are today. And I want to just take a couple slides here to sort of, again, use the adoption curve to explain how it sort of shows us where we're at and where the evolution might be on CSR. So the idea of adoption curves is over time, there's an adoption curve of a particular product and service, then another adoption curve may come along and another adoption curve may come along that sort of shows how innovation is happening. And those adoption curves may overlap. We know certainly, for example, in the world today, social media applications, we started with Facebook, but now there's WhatsApp and there's WeChat and there's Instagram and there's this sort of constant, level of adoption of new technologies that come along within the same space, but over time, those new adoptions begin to sort of innovate and continue to change the sector. And I think that is true as well for CSR. And this is also, by the way, I think one of the places where small to medium-sized businesses can really take advantage of and be a lot more nimble. There's a company in the States called Sonos. They're a relatively small to medium-sized business. They make electronic audio products. They're really high quality. They're one of the most advanced, nimble companies in terms of CSR I've ever come across. And I think a lot of that's because they're a small company. And they're able to be more nimble and they're able to make more adjustments in a much quicker sort of facile way. Next slide. So this is a little bit busy, I admit that. So hang with me here. I know there's a lot on that slide, so I'll just make sure I describe it to you. If you think about this sort of overlapping of adoption curves and new edges of innovation in the CSR field, in the 2000s, sort of the leading edge, as I said a minute ago, was sustainability. Well, then along came climate in the 2010s, right? And now that is a really key leading edge in terms of CSR. And in just a minute, we'll talk about what I think the next leading edge is going to be. Next slide. So to just sort of finish up where we're at in the 2020s, now we see more and more small and medium-sized businesses coming into CSR. The context is a world that is as complex and as inequitable, I think, as it ever has been in nearly 100 years. That isn't just in America, I think all around the world. The structure of really effective CSR companies are those that are able to make social responsibility a seamless part of their business. And in terms of actors now we think of our employees and our companies and our customers as stakeholders. So there's a lot more actors sort of involved in CSR. Slide down. So let me just give you a couple quick examples of what was on that slide, just to sort of amplify the key trends and where we're at in terms of CSR in the 2020s. So in terms of companies, there is a company called Y Scouts that's a recruiting firm. They do corporate searches, but everything they do as a corporate search has an overlay of social responsibility to it. So they don't do searches just for sort of say an extractive industry. Everything they do is about working with companies that have a social purpose to them. So they're sort of building the ecosystem of social responsibility. When it comes to context, I talked to you about a complexity and inequity. And that's really the context for the book that I just finished writing. But just to emphasize it, I think that the amount of complexity that we face is in the world right now, geopolitical, climate change, dealing with technology, you could just go on and on and on. The amount of challenges and problems we have to deal with are as significant as they've been in decades. And inequity, I know it's true in America. We are a much more inequitable country, economically, racially, educationally today than we were 25 years ago. So the context for CSR is much greater complexity and much greater inequity than we've faced in a long time. That structure of it being seamless, there are more and more companies today now that I think that CSR is, it's not bolted on, it's not sort of a PR opportunity, it's not even something they do sort of as a project basis. It is a fundamental part of their business. For me, a great example is Microsoft, that company I started with. CSR is fundamentally woven into who they are as a company today. And lastly, on that part of when I talked about actors and stakeholders, now there's a movement around stakeholder capitalism. And you see companies like BlackRock, one of the leading private equity firms in the world, they talk about making their investments of their capital only around places where there's a social purpose and a social cause attached to the company. Slide back up. So the new edge to me of CSR in the 2020s is mental health. And I think that's true in many parts of the world. I know it's true in the States. I know it's true in Singapore. And it sort of follows on climate. And there's no question that the last 15 months of this pandemic has changed a lot of things in the world. I think one of the most important things it's done for CSR is it's made mental health a leading edge today for CSR. Next slide. So if I relate it back to just a couple slides ago when I talked about the notion of how adoption curves kind of overlap themselves, today I think the latest adoption curve and the new edge of CSR is mental health. So sustainability still matters, climate still matters, but the companies that are really out in front, really leading on CSR today, I think it's going to be around mental health. Next slide. So just to sort of summarize the future in the 2020s, I said this a minute ago, I just want to sort of emphasize it, and then I'm going to talk about mental health specifically, but it's more and more about small to medium-sized businesses. The context for our CSR these days is complexity and inequity. The structure of companies is more and more seamless. The actors are a broader range of stakeholders, and the new edge is around mental health. Next slide, please. So around mental health, I'm going to do the same thing I did just a minute ago for CSR. I'm going to sort of touch on a few key points, and then I'll be done, and we'll have a conversation with Augustine. But these to me are intended to be for you sort of talking points, thinking points about how you can think about CSR and mental health being the new edge for CSR in the decade we're in and the decade ahead of us. So I'll talk about context. I'll talk about culture and corporate acceptance, innovators, some of the risk and benefits, some examples, how it's not just a nice to have, but a must have, and how it affects productivity and profitability. So slide down, please. So I'm going to touch on each one of those just for a minute, and then that will conclude my presentation. So context for mental health. We all know about COVID-19, social unrest around the world. I believe in the States and Singapore, it's to some degree, it's still a cultural taboo. And yet I just read a month ago in Forbes magazine, an article entitled "Singapore is an International Model for Mental Health." And I think the other context for mental health being a leading edge is young workers and teens coming into these companies these days. There is a greater degree of anxiety than I think and depression there ever has been in any generation that ever preceded it. So if you're a company, that's your future workforce, you better be thinking about mental health. The second sort of thought piece around mental health as a leading edge for CSR is cultural and corporate acceptance. As I said just a minute ago, to some degrees, there's still a stigma and a taboo around it in both of our countries. But what you also see today is, for example, you see a lot of athletes and sports stars. We just saw Naomi Osaka of Japan withdraw from Wimbledon because of it. So we see more and more athletes sort of speaking out about sports stars. And what it does is it starts to normalize it, makes it sort of more okay to talk about it. It makes it more culturally acceptable. It makes it more acceptable inside of corporations. And I think within corporations, it also enables us to start to move mental health beyond just something that might be just an HR function into something that's more about executive management, and it's more about the brand of the company as a whole. So that's sort of part of the culture and corporate evolution, I think, that's going on today that's leading to mental health being the leading edge of CSR. I talked about innovations and adaptations. IBM is a company that's been around for decades. Their head of HR She's one of the leading thinkers. And one of the ways she frames mental health in an innovative way is we've talked about work-life balance. Today, she said we need to think about work-life integration. So it's not just about balance, it's about integration and about how mental health and our daily lives integrate better with our companies. We don't want them to blur together totally, but we also don't want them to be totally separate silos. We need people to think about work and life and mental health, not just being in balance, but also being integrated into our work. The fourth factor I talked about in terms of mental health being the leading edge for CSR is around risks and benefits. There are risks to it. There are risks to any innovation, right? There are early adopters and innovators, and they take risks. But just like there's risks, there's also benefits associated with that. And I think that I will say this, I believe that the opportunities in mental health or the responsibility is significant. If you want to talk about the risks of doing it, there are risks of it. There is a far greater risk of not committing to mental health in your company. So when you think about the challenges of sort of taking on mental health, there are things to be cognizant of and risks to deal with. The far greater risk is ignoring it altogether. And those companies that choose to ignore mental health in the decade ahead, they will be in a very negative position 10 years from now. The next thing I talked about were examples and explorations. A friend of mine is working on a curriculum that she calls trauma-informed management. The idea is how can managers be effective at dealing with trauma and how can they understand the mental health of their employees? So that's a really good example to me of one area of exploration around mental health. The next to last point I talked about was taking mental health and CSR as sort of a nice to have to eventually a must have. And it'll take time for us to get there. And yet the last 15 months, I think one of the silver linings of what we just went through is it accelerated the ability and the sort of normalization of things like mental health in the private sector. So I think mental health being a part of CSR, it was sort of a much more challenging even 18 months ago. And what we all just went through, COVID, global pandemic, global connectedness, social unrest, that all made mental health not just sort of a nice to have, but a must have part of CSR. And the last thing I'll talk about is its effect on productivity and profit. I think in the last handful of years, people have sort of come to accept the idea that gender and racial diversity are not just a good thing to do. They make us more productive as a company and they make us more profitable. And what I believe is that around mental health just isn't just a good thing to do for our employees. It's also an important thing that contributes to the productivity and then ultimately the profitability of our companies. So that's just some thoughts on how and why I think mental health is a leading edge of CSR for the 2020s. And I'll just say to you, everyone listening, thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to taking your questions, and I'll cover anything all the way from farming to technology and Microsoft and Nestle to where I think CSR has come from and where it is today and where it's going in the future. So thank you for your time, Augustine. Love to have a conversation.
And at this point, I just want to do a quick recap for our people who have joined us in the virtual community. So for those of you who are joining us, you're watching LCCS's REALink 2021 Virtual Conversation Series, where we are talking about pertinent social issues. And of course, it's all about bringing communities together. Rebuilding the community is the theme. I'm Augustine Antoine, and with us today is Paul Shoemaker. The topic, CSR, making it work for companies big and small. And at this point, a very quick video we'd like to share with you. LCCS does engage and works and reaches out to various stakeholders, and we want to make it a meaningful experience for the stakeholders as well. So here's a video that we'd like to share with you, and we encourage you to reach out to us at LCCS so we can talk more about this. Let's watch the video. once again, thank you for patiently watching us. And that video definitely brings back memories. It's a special montage of how LCCS works with the private sector, and in particular, we want to also mention, once again, it's a fundraising campaign, this entire conversation series that we are running. So your donation will be eligible for a one-to-one matching, as REALink is part of the Tote Board Enhanced Fundraising Program. So donations above $10 are eligible for a 250% tax deduction, and it goes towards supporting LCCS and empowering and engaging individuals and families to build and restore those relationships. And it's very much in line with today's topic, and I want to bring Paul Shoemaker back into the conversation. Paul, when I had the privilege of doing research on you, I came across the book, Taking Charge of Change. That's the title of your book, and the full title is Taking Charge of Change, How Rebuilders Solve Hard Problems. And listening to your presentation earlier and linking it up to what I'm going to bring up next, you actually introduced readers to your book to leaders and change agents, and you've dubbed them as rebuilders. I'd like you to tell us how these rebuilders actually solve problems that we are faced with today.
So thank you, Augustine. So the book was not just in the context of CSR. It was certainly part of it was CSR, but it was also just in the sort of broader context of social challenges facing us today. Some of that context and inequity I talked about earlier. So in that context, what I've been spending the last 3 years doing is trying to understand what kind of leaders do we need in our companies and our nonprofits and in our public sector organizations. Not in terms of strategy or building teams or culture, all good, important leadership traits, but what kind of leadership is it that we uniquely need in the world today to face the complexities, address the inequities, and make progress on really important things like corporate social responsibility. So that was sort of the undergirding of the book. And my research sort of, for me, amplified 5 particular traits of leaders that were especially important. And we can get into those more later if we want to. But the idea of those leaders as rebuilders, that term, that theme to me was an important way to describe how I'm thinking about leaders today, which is we are, in a lot of cases in America, in a lot of cases in parts of the world, there's always innovation. Innovation is always good. But we're also in a lot of cases that we are rebuilding, we are re-innovating, we are reimagining, we are re-engineering. Our world just went through an incredibly challenging 15 months, and most of the world is still going through that pandemic. So this is not just about innovation, it's about rebuilding, remaking, rethinking. And I think that idea of not just thinking we're starting from scratch, but taking what we have today and building and rebuilding on that is a really important concept. So I use that metaphor, Augustine, to sort of be a container to tie together the 5 traits of those folks that I think are the most effective leaders at solving hard problems today.
I certainly love that term, that phrase, rebuilders. And then picking up on the point about leadership, I mean, earlier you did talk about how important it is, and the Unilever example, and how they're doing good for society. And of course, they still have to be a profitable business as well, right, in order to help back. But there's another aspect that I found as I did research, and then you've met people who are basically masters of trust. And it's a currency that companies and brands definitely need to earn, right? So could you briefly unwrap that for us? I mean, It's all part of that conversation that we kicked off earlier.
Absolutely. So one of the 5 traits that I think is really, truly, there's lots of leadership traits that matters, but to me, there's 5 traits that are particularly important if we're going to navigate in an equitable world and we're going to deal with and face the complexity that we have. One of those 5 is what I call generosity mindset. And a generosity mindset, I'll speak for the States. In a lot of ways, that's not really the sort of predominant way people are thinking about how working together. There's a lot of division. There's a lot of acrimony. So leaders that come along that have a mindset of generosity, these are leaders that think from abundance. They don't get diverted by the noise. They sort of understand the end game and they can keep their eyes on it. They know how to get everyone involved. They know how to make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. All those things sound really nice. They're incredibly hard to do in practice. So these leaders that have a generosity mindset, there's many sort of tools that they use. Their number one currency is trust. They are what I call masters of trust. And through how they work with other people, the ability to get the most out of others, to get the best out of others, the ability to look around the room and say, who's missing that needs to be here? The ability to look around the room and say, who's here that we can get more from? Just having somebody in the room that thinks that way is so vital. It's so critical. And that makes those leaders so important. And when they build trust, that's the way they're able to be the most effective, is when they are able to build that trust. And I'll describe and talk about trust as one of the most rarest, most valuable natural resources in the world today. And I truly think when you look at somewhere like America and other parts of the world and the divisions that we have, the thing that we lack the most, the thing that's gotten lost the most is trust. And that is the asset and the sort of capital that we need to rebuild the most is trust.
It's very true, Paul, and very important in Asia and most certainly in Singapore as well. Another important point that you brought up is authenticity, being authentic 24/7. I like this one as well. And once again, you've been meeting people, the walking, talking 24/7 authentic people who live that authentic life 24/7. It sounds, like I wish I could be like that. But what are the signs of a truly authentic person? And I want to link it back to our talk about CSR. I mean, it builds on the earlier point that currency of trust as well. Over to you.
No question. So I'll connect it in multiple ways. But if you remember back to the slide that I showed on what are sort of the seven key factors that have made companies effective in CSR, the last one was authenticity and longevity. Longevity, excuse me. So the idea of 24/7 authenticity, this comes to me from the place of the world we live in today and the divisions we have, and also the challenge of sort of having a degree of shared facts, shared truths, things we argue and we disagree about, but do we have even sort of like a common platform of facts and truths that we can agree upon? And 24/7 authentic leaders are those folks that have this sort of persistent, relentless commitment to integrity, honesty, and particularly, I think, to personal accountability. So again, just like a generosity mindset, that's what I just described there, that relentless, persistent commitment to integrity and personal accountability sounds really nice. It's an incredibly rare commodity today, and it's more and more unique. And I think the 24/7 part of it responds to not only the need for it, but the need to live it sort of in every part of your life constantly, because we're all on social media, we're all in the media, we're all sort of so much more exposed. So you can't sort of practice this notion of authenticity for 8 hours a day and go home and sort of behave a different way at home or in other parts of the world. We're so integrated in all the parts of our world now, and we're sort of leaders in particular are so visible. So that notion of authenticity is not only important unto itself, it also has to be something that's practiced on like 24/7, 365. And those kinds of leaders that are able to do that, I think their ability to lead and their effectiveness is so, so critical, so, so vital in the world today.
Well, Paul, really fascinating listening to you. And I do have a couple of questions here that have come in with the LCCS team. So I'd like to pack it all in and if we can go through the questions as quickly as possible. One of them is about change agents within, whether it's a large, and you also shared in your presentation earlier about small companies making a difference. Can you paint us a picture about how change agents can solve big and hard problems?
Yeah. So think about the world we live in, and the organizations are flatter. The ability to communicate with others is greater. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes that's a bad thing. And the awareness of solutions to problems is much greater and much more accessible. So that's sort of, if you will, the soil of the world we all live in today. It's very different than it was 20, even 10 years ago. So I think the ability of one person, an individual person, or let's say a small team or a small business to be an agent of change is so much greater than it used to be. We used to live in sort of a much more top-down command and control world. You had to have a certain amount of, physical assets to be able to, have impact. And a lot of those sort of barriers to entry, if you will, have come down and down and down over the course of time. So I think that's the soil in which change agents today can do their work. It's a lot more fertile. There's a lot more of that soil. People can choose to abuse it, but they can also choose to do a lot of positive things with it. So I think change agents have a lot more resources, ability, assets, know how to create change. And they also live in a world, I think, where people, particularly inside of small companies, they are willing to let their employees lead from the bottom up. But we don't have to sort of like wait for one leader on top. That's a good thing. We also want to see lots of individual leaders. So what I would hope folks did with today was not just think about CSR from an organizational standpoint, but think about it from an individual standpoint. How can I be a leader? How can I be one of those leaders that in those companies that leads that kind of change? I didn't, sort of describe that as one of the structural components of CSR in the 20s, but I easily could. I could say another one of those key structural components to CSR in the 20s is individual empowerment. We don't have to wait for someone from the top. We don't have to wait for big organizations. More people can be a change agent because they have more resources and more tools and more ability and more know-how to do so. And there are far fewer barriers to entry today to being a change agent on your own.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm glad you also brought up the topic about mental health. We're going to come to that. So building up to that, and that's with the time that we have left, is I keep looking at the clock here. Probably we'll end on that as our closing question. But building towards that, listening to you carefully, can anyone be a rebuilder or an agent of change amidst the current challenges that we're facing with COVID-19 all over the world, in America, and most certainly here in Asia as well?
So I wrote a book in 2015 called Can't Not Do, Bad Grammar. It was about philanthropy and volunteerism. And then I wrote a book in 2021 that was called Taking Charge of Change. And they both sort of, and this was sort of more about leadership today and the kind of rebuilders we need as leaders in the decade ahead. But both of them, in a sense, are very much about the ability and the empowerment of individuals to create change, whether it's in their philanthropy or volunteerism, like I wrote about in 2015, or more in a corporate or cross-sector context that I wrote about in Taking Charge of Change in 2021. So can anyone be a rebuilder, a change agent, a leader themselves? The answer is yes. Will everyone? No. But in the 2015 book, what I was trying to do, the way I framed that book was to pose 6 questions that folks could try to answer for themselves to be more effective as a philanthropist and a volunteer. And in 2021, the book that I wrote, it focuses on and spotlights 5 vital traits that I think are most important to be a leader in the decade ahead in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. So the guidebook in 2015 was 6 questions. The guidebook, if you will, the playbook in 2021 is 5 vital traits. And I think all of us can take inventory on ourselves as an individual, as a team, as an organization, and say, which of those traits do we possess? Which ones are missing and we need to build? And what do I need to build? What's the edge? What sort of muscle do I need to build as a leader in terms of being a more effective leader in the decade ahead? For example, for myself, I think my greatest strength of those 5 traits is what I call cross-sector fluency, the ability to jump across those sectors in a very fluent way. And I think my biggest challenge is around having the capacity to deal with complexity. I can tend to be a pretty linear thinker and sort of get in a box sometimes and not get outside of that box. But it gives me sort of a checklist, a guidebook to understand what are strengths I can build on and what are weaknesses I need to sort of overcome and develop within myself.
So I wanted to bring in this part when I did the research. You can't solve problems outside your home until you solve the problems within your home. Could someone who is struggling, and I'm choosing the words here very carefully, could someone who is broken be part of a larger effort and agent of change and make a difference?
So the answer to that question is yes. And as, one of the places Augustine got that from was a couple of weeks ago, in conjunction with my book, I did a talk with a former NFL football player in the States. His name was Doug Baldwin. And he's a really interesting guy that thinks a lot about leadership, and sort of his need to sort of go inside himself and be strong inside before he goes outside to lead in the world. So can folks that are sort of, and this all relates to mental health, right? And being willing to be more open about that and culturally accepting of that. So can somebody that has a mental health challenge, can they be part of change? The answer is yes. Is it going to be harder for them? Yes, because they're dealing with their own mental challenges. One of the best ways to sort of overcome your mental health and your mental challenges is to go try to work on a problem, work on a challenge, help someone else, not just look inside yourself, but help someone else. But I will say, I think in terms of mental health in the 2020s, we used to have physical health challenges that we still have. The degree of mental health challenges we have today in the 2020s, all over the world, they're greater than they ever have been. There's lots of theories about why that is, right? The world's moving too fast. Technology moves too fast. Social media, spreads, disagreement and disparagement. There's a lot of reason why there's mental health problems. But I do believe in the power of an individual, whatever their sort of state of mental health, to create positive change. And one of the things that I hope mental health as a sort of leading edge of CSR, what it does is it enables more people that have mental health challenges to sort of be able to find solutions and find answers, and not have it be the sort of siloed and over in the corner taboo. But we make mental health a part of CSR within companies, not only to be better to our employees, but also to be a more productive and a more profitable company.
Perfect segue. I mean, I planned for this when I did my research. So Paul, you're absolutely spot on. I did get that quote from that conversation that you had with the great athlete in the United States. And it definitely was inspiring listening to both of you in that conversation. Home stretch, community solutions. So let's go deeper into this. We are definitely hearing about mental health in today's society, most certainly here in Singapore and all over the world. So people are starting to speak up. They're asking for support. So in an era of corporate social responsibility and mental health awareness, what would you like to see happen, Paul? I mean, definitely with companies who are in a position to enact policies and things like that.
Right. So go back to our adoption curve, right? Any product or service or movement or something like CSR, they go through cycles of adoption. So, the idea of mental health being a part of a corporate agenda or CSR agenda 40 years ago, that it had been impossible. It wouldn't have been on the radar. So first of all, it takes time for people to sort of get used to the idea. We need to sort of build critical mass of people that talk about it, sort of socialize the idea to make it at least acceptable to have the conversation. So I think we've made some real progress on that. You've also started to see companies, when they think about benefits for their employees, benefits used to mainly be about physical health, used to be about extra compensation, what's the medical care of the rest of my family, but it wasn't so much about mental health. And now when it comes to benefits around companies, more and more you see mental health on the benefits list for companies. And it's what people think about in terms of how they treat their employees well. So we're trying to get more used to talking about it and normalizing it. We're making it sort of more part of the benefits conversation in companies. And I think the leading edge of it, the sort of new edge for mental health in companies, is the ability to think of it not just as I said, like a bolt-on or sort of, part of the HR department, but make it a part of every manager and every leader's job, not to become a counselor, not to become a therapist for your employees, right? That's sort of getting outside their bailiwick, but to be able to understand that that's a part of what makes a whole person when they show up at work. And if we want our people to be as productive as possible, if we want them to be as happy at work as possible, if we want to retain and develop the best people at work, we need to think more about mental health as managers, as leaders. I did some research in how corporate America was thinking about racial equity in the current times, particularly coming through the last 15 months. And I will tell you, I heard one word more from CEOs in the last 15 months than in the previous 15 years. And that word was listen. Listen. And I think when it comes to mental health inside of a company, the first step is to listen. It isn't just to tell. It isn't just to direct. It isn't just to drive. It's to step back and to listen to our teams and our people and our employees. So I think we're going through an evolution as companies where mental health becomes not just sort of acceptable, not part of benefits, but actually a part of how managers think about their people. And the last thing I'll say about it is if folks don't believe in that, the companies that don't believe that mental health is sort of on the leading edge and a new edge of CSR, if they're sort of in that same place 10 years from now, they are not going to be able to attract and retain and develop the talent. They're not going to have as productive employees. They're not going to have as profitable of a company. So I think there's a lot of positive reasons to do it. There's also a reason to do it, which is to not be on the back edge, the laggard edge of the curve of CSR.
Thank you so much, Paul. You beautifully given us some very important points to take home. Of course, I mean, right from the onset, from your presentation included. I like that point about listening. Two more questions, and we have to wrap it up. If you could briefly just give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned corporate, and we saw that success story earlier with that little montage with LCCS working with the private sector in Singapore. But frankly, how much power should the private sector have? Should we sort of like lean on them? I mean, under this whole topic of CSR.
What an important question. I'll say there's two sides to the same coin. One side of that coin is there is a real conversation about how powerful a handful of companies have become in the world. A handful of them are American technology companies. A handful of them are Asian companies. There's certainly more of a concentration of corporate power today. There probably has been in maybe back in the oil companies, the turn of the previous century, but there's a lot of concentration of power, and that's an important conversation to have. The other side of that same coin is, what I also think is when it comes to social challenges and social problems, I think we need the private sector. We need the corporate sector. We have to have the private sector more today than we ever have before. The corporate sector is where the power of wealth and levers are. We need them to pull them for social progress and social good in our community. So we need to be cognizant of their power, and yet we need them. We need the private sector more today. And the positive thing is I see corporations stepping up to that responsibility more than ever have before too.
All right, Paul, I'm getting the signal from our production team that we do have to wrap it up, but if you could give us 30 seconds response to my final question, a fortified idea. I want to take this out and create an impact in the world. What should happen next?
If you're an individual that wants to?
Yes.
You know what? Let's say it sort of starts from within. The topic I tried to end up with is that mental health is the leading edge, the new edge of CSR. I think if each of us will, and both of my books try to help you do that, sort of look inside ourselves and take inventory of ourselves and say, what are the key questions to answer for ourselves, and what are the key traits and qualities we need to possess as leaders that will enable us to be forward-thinking leaders? I think it's about intention and putting ourselves in a purposeful way to think about the kind of leader that we need to be, not just around teams and culture, but around how we want to make the world a better place to live.
Thank you so much, Paul Shoemaker. And this is a small token of appreciation. We can't really see it right now, but we're going to send this to you. It's called Fables Talk. And I mean, the first one is actually a story about the rainbow butterfly. And on the flip side, some questions on reflection. The LCCS team will be sending this to you by mail soon. And this is going to be published in August. It's one of the initiatives here at LCCS. And I think on that note, once again, a gentle reminder to all who are with us on this session, the third in our series. Please continue to stay with us and support us. It's part of our ongoing efforts to create genuine conversations. And of course, a gentle reminder, you can support the campaign by donating generously by using the QR code below and on the link that is provided. And we want to call your attention to our REALink Conversation Series that's happening Friday, 23rd July, 7:30 p.m. Our guest speaker will be Lo Lee Jing, and we'll be discussing neighbors' disputes. But with that, I want to come back and say once again, Paul Shoemaker, truly wonderful listening to you and having this exchange of questions and getting your responses. In the hearing impact community, we cheer and we clap this way as well. Safe journeys, my friend, with your family as you continue your trip in the United States. And to the rest of you, please do continue to support us at LCCS. We thank you so much. And from all of us here at the LCCS team and this huge production crew, we say, stay with us. The journey continues. I'm Augustine Antoine. On behalf of all of us here at LCCS, thank you once again. And stay tuned for the REALink Virtual Conversation Series.